The car rumbled down the dark, empty road, the soft hum of the engine filling the silence. The family of 4 was on their way to a reunion, a much-needed escape from the chaos of daily life. The kids sat in the back, already half asleep, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of the dashboard lights. Their parents exchanged quiet conversation about the days ahead, when suddenly the piercing sound of a siren shattered the calm. Marcus, the father of the family, stiffened, his grip tightening around the steering wheel, his heart racing. Keisha, his wife, instinctively tensed beside him. She didn't say anything, but he could feel her nervous energy radiating off her. Her eyes flickered between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. She saw the lights flashing behind them, and her breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to say it out loud, but she knew what this was all about. Marcus was black, and in this small town that often meant trouble. They had already been on the road for hours, trying to reach their destination without a hitch. But now this moment had arrived, the moment they'd both dreaded since their first turn onto this isolated stretch of road. The cops had pulled them over, but why? What had they done wrong? Was it because they were an unfamiliar car driving down this empty road at night? Or was it something else? Was it simply because of how they looked? Marcus glanced at Keisha, their eyes meeting in a brief exchange that said it all. They both knew what was coming, but neither one of them knew how far it would go. Marcus slowed the car to a stop, his mind racing through every possibility of what could happen next. Was he going to get out of this with his family safe, or would this turn into another one of those tragic stories that he heard about on the news every other week? As the officer walked up to their car, the low thump of boots on gravel echoed in the quiet night. The officer was tall and stocky, his face partially hidden under the brim of his hat. As he approached the window, Marcus could feel his pulse quicken. The officer didn't smile, didn't offer any friendly gesture. Instead, his eyes locked onto Marcus with an intensity that made him feel like he was being judged for everything. He was everything he had ever been, his blackness hanging in the air like a target. The officer didn't speak at first, just stood there, with his hand resting on his hip, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Finally, the officer broke the silence. Step out of the vehicle. His voice was gruff, his tone commanding. Marcus' heart skipped a beat. The officer's hand hovered near the gun at his side, his body language indicating that this wasn't just a simple traffic stop. Marcus knew he had to be careful. One wrong move, and things could escalate, but he had to protect his family. His wife and children were sitting there staring wide-eyed at the officer. Keisha reached out to him, her hand trembling in his. The officer hadn't asked for any reason or explanation, just a demand. "What's going on, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice calm, despite the chaos building inside him. "You fit the description." The officer replied, his words cold and clipped. A description of what? Marcus tried to stay composed, though every fiber of his being wanted to scream out, this was wrong, this wasn't right. "You know what I mean," the officer sneered, his eyes narrowing as he studied Marcus. He didn't bother explaining anything further. "Step out of the car." The words hung in the air as Marcus felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. His family was in danger now. He wasn't sure how, but he could feel it. Something was off. Keisha's grip tightened on his hand, a quiet plea in her eyes. She knew just as well as he did that they were no longer in control of this moment. The kids were quiet now, but the fear was evident in their eyes. Marcus could feel their gaze burning into the back of his head, like they were both depending on him to make the right decision. But what was the right decision? How could he protect them from what was coming next? With a deep breath, Marcus slowly opened the door. He didn't know if it was the right choice, but it was the only choice he had to make. The officer's eyes followed him closely as he stepped out of the car. The officer reached out, grabbing Marcus' arm and pulling him roughly to the side. "Hey!" Keisha shouted, her voice rising in panic. "What are you doing to him?" The officer didn't even glance at her. Instead, he pushed Marcus roughly against the hood of the car. The weight of his body slammed into the metal, making Marcus wince in pain, but he didn't fight back. Keisha's voice faltered as she shouted for him again, but the officer didn't respond. He stood behind Marcus like a wall between him and his family. The kids were starting to cry now, their small voices piercing through the tension. Keisha's face turned pale as she looked from Marcus to the officer and back to her children. "Please don't hurt him," she whispered under her breath, but the officer was relentless. Marcus could feel his blood rising, the anger building inside him, but he knew better than to make any sudden moves. With the officer's hand on his back, pushing him down further against the hood, he wasn't sure how much longer he could stay composed. The officer barked out an order to his partner, who had circled around to the back of the car. Marcus could hear the sound of the trunk popping open, the rusted hinges creaking in the night. The second officer began digging through their luggage, pulling out bags and tossing them aside with no care. All Keisha tried to sit up straighter, trying to keep her composure for the sake of their kids, but the tears streamed down her face as she watched her family get torn apart by this senselessness. The officer who had stopped them seemed to take his time, as if he was enjoying the control he had over the situation. He wasn't just trying to intimidate Marcus, he was trying to break him, trying to remind him of his place. "What do you think you're doing?" Marcus said through clenched teeth, his voice steady, but his eyes cold as he turned back to look the officer in the face. "Checking your trunk." The officer replied with a sneer as he dug through the family's things. "What's the problem?" Officer Marcus' voice was firm now. He had had enough. He wasn't going to let them humiliate him any longer. "We're just on a family trip, officer. We're not bothering anyone." The officer didn't respond. He just pulled out another bag from the trunk and tossed it to the side, as if it were trash. "You got something to hide?" the officer asked in a mocking tone. Marcus stood taller now. He knew he had to fight for his family. He couldn't let them see him back down. "No, sir," Marcus answered through clenched teeth. "I'm a federal agent," he said, the words slowly and deliberately letting them sink in, but the officer didn't flinch. "Yeah, right," the officer muttered dismissively, but Marcus could see the shift in the officer's eyes as he processed the words. "What was that?" the officer asked finally, with a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. Marcus straightened his shoulders. He wasn't backing down now. "I'm an FBI agent," he repeated, his voice low and strong. His badge and gun were hidden beneath his jacket, but he had no doubt that the officer could tell by his stance alone that he was not someone to be trifled with. The officer didn't say anything for a long moment. The silence stretched out between them like a wall, but just as Marcus was about to speak again, a voice came from behind them. Another officer, a third one, appeared on the scene. Out of nowhere, it seemed his presence like a cold wind cutting through the tension. "What's going on here?" the new officer asked, his voice calm, almost soothing. The two officers turned toward him. For a brief moment, their faces briefly softening before they quickly returned to their professional masks. Marcus didn't know whether to feel relieved or more suspicious, but before he could react, the new officer's gaze shifted to him, his eyes scanning Marcus for any signs of threat or resistance. "We're just trying to sort this out, officer," the stocky one said with a half-hearted wave of his hand, but the third officer didn't seem convinced. His eyes never left Marcus. "I'll take it from here," he said, his tone more authoritative than the others had been. For the first time that night, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they were getting out of this mess, but the officer's next words made him feel even more uncertain. "You're free to go," the officer said quickly, but there was something in his voice, a quiet sense of warning that made Marcus hesitate. The officer wasn't just letting them go for the sake of it. Marcus knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The damage had already been done. He had a family to protect, but now he was being watched more closely than ever before. As Marcus got back into the car, his hands still shaking slightly from the tension of the stop, he tried to focus on the road ahead, but the weight of what had just happened kept pressing down on him. The sound of his children crying in the back seat was almost more than he could bear. He could feel Keisha's eyes on him, but he kept his gaze fixed on the headlights cutting through the darkness. It felt like a dream, a nightmare that wouldn't end. Every moment was replaying in his head, every word from the officer, every push against the hood of the car. But he was free now, right? They were free to go, but what if that wasn't the end? What if they were being watched now even more closely? What if this was just the beginning? Keisha didn't say anything at first. She just stared out the window, but Marcus could feel the weight of her thoughts in the silence. Her fear, her confusion, her trust in him as a protector being shaken to its core. He could feel the anger in her too. It was all there under the surface, simmering, just waiting to boil over, but she was holding it in for the sake of the children. She knew that this wasn't the time to break down. They had to move forward. They had to keep going, but neither of them knew where that road would lead them next. The rest of the drive was in silence. The occasional sniffle from the kids, the only sound breaking through the tension. Marcus focused on the road, trying to push aside the panic that was slowly creeping in. The kids had stopped crying now, but he could hear their soft breaths from the back seat, the sound of their hearts beating in rhythm with his own. They were both trying to process what had happened, but there was no easy way to make sense of it. How could they explain it to the kids? How could they explain to them that this wasn't just a random stop, that it had nothing to do with the car or the road? It was because they were a black family in a small town in the middle of nowhere. Marcus knew the truth. But how could he say that out loud to his children? The ride was long, but it didn't feel long enough. By the time they pulled up to the small motel where they were staying the night, the tension was thick in the air. The kids had fallen asleep, but Keisha's eyes were wide open, staring out the window as if she were looking for something in the darkness. Marcus didn't know what to say to her. He didn't know how to make it better, how to fix what had just happened, but they both knew it wasn't over. They were in too deep. Now he could feel the weight of it in his chest, the injustice of it, the way they had been treated, the way they had been dehumanized, but he couldn't let it show. Not in front of Keisha, not in front of the kids. They were finally at the motel. Marcus parked the car and turned off the engine, but he didn't move at first. He just sat there staring out the windshield. For a moment, Keisha didn't say anything, but he could feel her waiting for him to make a move. She was scared, too scared for him, scared for their family, scared for what might happen. Next, Keisha finally spoke, her voice small but firm. He turned to look at her, but she was still staring out the window, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice cracking with emotion. It wasn't just fear now, it was desperation, a plea for him to make sense of it, to make them feel safe again. But he couldn't answer her, not right away. Not when he was still trying to make sense of it all. He didn't know how to fix what was broken. He didn't know how to undo what had been done. He wasn't sure he could even protect them from what was coming next, but he had to try. He had to find a way to make sure they were all okay. "We'll be okay," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Keisha turned to look at him now, her eyes searching his face for any hint of reassurance, but she didn't find any. She knew as well as he did that the fight wasn't over. She could see it in the way his shoulders were tense, the way his jaw was clenched. She could see the way his eyes darted to the door as if waiting for someone to come knocking any moment. She didn't ask any more questions. She just nodded and grabbed the kids' bags from the back seat. She was done with the silence. She was done pretending that everything was fine. They were all exhausted physically and emotionally, but there was no time for rest. Not yet. They needed to get to their room and settle in. And then Marcus would have to figure out what to do next. He didn't know how long it had been since they had arrived, but the night had fallen deeper around them. The motel parking lot was empty, save for a few cars here and there. A dim light flickered from the front desk window, but that was the only sign of life. Marcus led the way to the door, his hand brushing against Keisha's as they walked in silence, their footsteps echoing in the still night. The kids followed behind them, both still half asleep, both too young to fully grasp what had just happened, but old enough to know that something wasn't right. Once inside their room, Marcus set down the bags and locked the door behind them. Keisha immediately sat down on the bed, her hands wringing together in her lap. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face told Marcus everything. She was terrified, she was angry, and she was broken, but she wasn't going to let it show in front of the kids. Marcus sat down beside her, his mind still racing with everything that had happened, the officer, the car, the way they had been treated. It didn't make sense to him, but what made even less sense was why they had been targeted in the first place. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Still, he kept checking the window every few minutes, hoping that he was wrong, but he knew he wasn't. Something was going to happen, and he wasn't sure if they would be ready for it. Keisha let out a long breath as she reached over to turn on the TV, but it only added to the noise in the room. She didn't want distractions. She needed peace, but peace was nowhere to be found. Not here, not now. Marcus could feel the weight of her gaze on him, and knew that she needed answers too. But how could he give them to her when he didn't have any himself? He needed to call in. But he didn't want to risk anything right now, not when they were already in too deep. So he waited. He sat there in the silence with her, their children asleep in the other room, their innocence still intact. But for how much longer? What would tomorrow bring? Would they ever feel safe again? The unknown was too much to bear, but they didn't have a choice. They would have to face it together one way or another. The morning came too quickly for Marcus. He had barely slept, tossing and turning in the uncomfortable bed. His mind never quieted, replayed the events of the previous night, over and over again. The siren, the officers, the way everything escalated so quickly. But the worst part was the uncertainty that followed. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger than just a random stop, and that scared him more than anything. The motel room was quiet. Now the kids were still asleep, their innocent faces unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Marcus could hear Keisha moving around in the bathroom, her soft footsteps muffled by the walls, but she hadn't said a word since they'd arrived last night. She hadn't even looked at him fully since the incident. The anger, the confusion, the hurt, it was all there in the way she held herself, her eyes avoiding his when she did glance his way. He knew she was scared, scared for him, scared for the kids, scared for everything they had worked for in their lives. Keisha emerged from the bathroom, her face pale, her hair messy. She hadn't bothered to do anything with it this morning, and that only made the tension worse. It was like the weight of everything had pressed down on them both so much that even the smallest task felt insurmountable. Marcus. Keisha's voice broke the silence. It was shaky, raw, like she had been holding something back for too long. We need to leave here. Marcus turned to face her, his heart dropping at the look in her eyes. He could see the fear there, but also something else, something deeper. She wasn't just scared for their safety. She was questioning everything she had trusted in him, and that hurt more than he wanted to admit. Keisha, we can't just leave, he said quietly, his voice hoarse. He didn't want to argue, but they couldn't just run. Not now, not when. They had no idea who might be watching. I know, she whispered, her shoulders sagging. I know, but I can't just sit here pretending everything's fine. I don't know what to do. I don't know who to trust. The words came out in a rush, as if she had been holding them inside for hours, or maybe days. Keisha, listen to me. Marcus stood up now, his voice firmer than before. He took a few steps toward her and reached out to gently take her hand. We can't just leave because we don't know who is behind this. We don't know if someone's watching or if they'll try to follow us. The last thing we need is to make a rash decision. Keisha pulled her hand back slowly, her eyes narrowing. And what are we supposed to do? Just wait here, wait for them to come after us again, wait for them to come for our family? Is that the plan? Marcus shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't blame her for feeling this way. He felt it to every moment since the arrest had been a wake-up call. But he had to be smart. He had to think ahead. We need to stay calm. We need to figure out who they are and why they targeted us, he said, his voice steady, but the doubt in his mind still lingering. He wasn't sure how to figure out who was behind this or why, but he had to try. Keisha sat down on the edge of the bed and buried her face in her hands, her body trembling slightly. I'm scared, Marcus. I'm scared for the kids. I'm scared for us. I don't know how much longer we can keep going like this. Her voice cracked and Marcus' heart broke at the sound of her pain. He sat down beside her now, pulling her close, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. He didn't know what to say because he didn't have the answers, but he couldn't let her carry this fear alone. He couldn't let her break down, not when they had each other. I know it's hard. I know, he whispered, his voice soft and comforting, but we have to hold on. We have to keep it together for them, for the kids. We're not alone in this. We've got each other, and we'll figure it out. Keisha nodded against his chest, but her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and Marcus held her tighter, wishing he could take away her fear, but he couldn't. All he could do was promise her that they would get through it together, but inside he wasn't sure he even believed his own words. Outside, the sun had begun to rise, casting a pale light across the parking lot. Marcus could hear the faint sound of traffic in the distance, but it felt like they were in a different world, one where time had stopped, and everything was just on hold, waiting for something else to happen. Marcus stood up after a moment, his hands shaking slightly, as he ran them through his hair. I need to call in, he said quietly. Keisha looked up at him, but didn't say anything. She just nodded. She knew he had to do this, knew it was the only way to find out what had happened last night, but the fear still lingered in her eyes as he dialed the number he knew by heart. It wasn't just anyone on the other end of the line. It was his colleague in the FBI, someone who had always been there for him in the past, someone who knew the risks of the job. Marcus. The voice on the other end was calm, but filled with concern. What's going on? I saw the report last night. Marcus' breath caught in his throat. The report from last night, the arrest. They'd made it, had already made the news. It wasn't just a random stop, Marcus said, his voice steady, despite the panic that still clawed at his chest. They were targeting me. I don't know why, but they knew who I was. There was silence on the other end, and Marcus could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Marcus, we need to talk, the voice said after a long pause. Meet me at the usual spot. Marcus felt a surge of relief, but it was quickly replaced by anxiety. He knew that meeting at the usual spot was a safe move, but it also meant he had to leave Keisha and the kids behind for a while, and he wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do. All right, Marcus said finally. I'll be there in an hour. He hung up the phone and turned back to Keisha. She was still sitting on the bed, her face a mixture of exhaustion and fear. He could see it in her eyes, the way she looked at him, like she was waiting for him to make a decision. The weight of the moment was heavy, but there was no time for indecision. Keisha, "I have to go meet with someone," he said, his voice tight. He didn't want to leave her alone, but he had no choice. "No, Marcus, please don't go. Don't leave us here like this." Keisha's voice broke, but she quickly covered it up. With a forced calm, "I can't handle this alone." Marcus walked over to her and kneeled down in front of her, his hands taking hers gently. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he said softly. "I promise you, I won't let anything happen to." As Keisha nodded, but the look in her eyes said it all. She didn't believe him, not completely, and he couldn't blame her. He didn't believe himself either, but he had to go now. He had to find out what was really going on. As Marcus left the room, he glanced back one last time at Keisha and the kids, their faces fading behind him. As he stepped out into the early morning light, the world felt different. Now everything was a little darker, a little more uncertain, but he had to keep moving forward. He had to find the answers that would lead them out of this mess, and he had to hope that he could do it before it was too late. Marcus drove through the winding roads of the small town, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, the tension from last night still hanging over him. The weight of what had happened and what was yet to come felt like a shadow trailing his every step. He couldn't stop thinking about Keisha and the kids, about how scared they were, how vulnerable they were. Right now he had to get answers. He had to make sure they were safe, but the fear that had settled deep in his chest wasn't something he could shake off so easily. He pulled up to the usual spot, an old diner on the outskirts of town, a place where he had met colleagues in the past, where things were always kept quiet, always neutral. He stepped out of the car and looked around before entering the diner. It was a small place, but it was reliable. There were no windows to see inside, just a simple door that creaked when he opened it. Inside, the place was dimly lit, the smell of coffee and grease in the air, the sound of low conversation coming from the few patrons scattered around. A waitress behind the counter gave him a quick nod, but didn't say anything. Marcus ignored the small talk around him, his eyes immediately scanning the room, looking for the familiar face he had come to trust over the years. He didn't have to wait long. A figure appeared from the back of the diner, walking towards him, a man in his late 40s with short graying hair and a stern expression. His name was James, and he was a longtime colleague in the FBI, someone Marcus had relied on when things got complicated. James slid into the booth across from him, his eyes quickly scanning Marcus before he leaned forward. "You're in deep this time," he said, his voice low and serious. Marcus didn't need to hear it to know he was right. He could feel it in his bones. He had never been more aware of the dangers surrounding him than he was now. "I need answers," Marcus said, his voice urgent. "They knew who I was last night. They targeted me on purpose, and I need to know why." James took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as he looked over his old friend. "I don't know everything, but I've been hearing rumors." He paused, glancing around the diner to make sure no one was listening. "There's been a lot of movement recently within the department. There's been some chatter about certain people being watched, but it's all hush-hush. It's not public yet. And we've got people who don't exactly play by the book." Marcus leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing at James's words. "What kind of people?" he asked, his voice tight with suspicion. James hesitated for a moment before answering, his eyes shifting to the side. "People who don't want to play by the rules, who want to use the system for their own purposes, people who see the FBI as just another tool to get what they want, and I think you've caught their attention." Marcus felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he processed James's words. He had always known that there were bad apples in every department, but this felt different. This felt like something deeper, something more dangerous. "What are they planning?" Marcus asked, his mind racing with the possibilities. "I'm not sure yet, but I've been getting reports that they've been targeting certain individuals. Anyone they think is a threat, anyone who doesn't fit their mold," James said, his voice low. "And you're one of those people, Marcus." Marcus' heart sank. He had always known that his job wasn't without risk, but he had never imagined that his life would be at risk in such a personal way, that his family would be dragged into this mess. "What do I do now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James looked around one last time before he leaned in even closer. "You need to get out of town. You need to lay low for a while until we can figure out who's behind this and why. But it's not safe for you to stay here anymore, not with the attention you've drawn." Marcus's mind raced. He couldn't just leave Keisha and the kids. They needed him now more than ever. But James was right. He couldn't risk their safety by staying here, not when he had no idea who was pulling the strings. "What about them?" Marcus asked, his voice full of concern. "You can't protect them if you stay here," James replied firmly. "You need to think about the bigger picture." Marcus, if you stay here, they'll come after your family next, and that's the last thing any of us want. Marcus sat back in the booth, his mind spinning with the weight of the decision he had to make. He had never been good at leaving things unfinished, but he had no choice. Now, it wasn't just about him, it was about his family and their safety, and he couldn't afford to make the wrong choice. He couldn't afford to let his emotions get in the way. "All right," Marcus said after a long pause. "I'll do it, I'll leave, but I need to make sure they're safe." James nodded. "I'll get you set up, I'll make sure they're protected, but you need to move fast. You don't have much time." Marcus stood up from the booth, his mind already shifting into problem-solving mode. He had always been a man of action, but this time felt different. This time he had something to lose, something real, something that mattered more than just his career. He turned to James one last time. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but full of gratitude. James gave him a quick nod. "You're not alone in this, Marcus. We've got your back." Marcus turned and walked out of the diner, his mind already focused on the next steps ahead. But as he stepped into the daylight, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was moving faster than he could keep up with. The pieces of this puzzle were slipping out of his grasp, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep it all together. He got into his car and drove back to the motel, his mind racing with what he had just learned. He had to get back to Keisha and the kids. He had to make sure they were all right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that even if he got them out of here, even if they ran, the danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. Marcus parked the car outside the motel, his heart pounding in his chest as he grabbed his bag and rushed toward the door. His thoughts were a whirlwind, trying to piece together the chaos that had unfolded, but his mind kept returning to Keisha and the kids. He had promised them that he would keep them safe, and now the reality of the danger they were in was more real than ever before. He didn't have much time. James had told him to get out of town and lay low, but he couldn't just disappear, not without making sure Keisha and the kids were all right. He couldn't leave them without knowing if they were going to be targeted next, if they were already being watched. It wasn't just about protecting them anymore, it was about ensuring they had a future to go back to when all of this was over. When the storm had passed, he pushed open the door to their room and stepped inside. Keisha was sitting at the small table by the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale, her eyes flickering with fear when she saw him. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him like she was waiting for him to tell her what came next. Marcus could feel the weight of her gaze pressing on him, her questions, her doubts, all hanging in the air, but he had no answers yet, no solutions, not yet. He closed the door behind him and walked over to her. "Keisha," his voice was quiet but urgent, "we need to go now." Her eyes widened with confusion. "What do you mean, go where?" She stood up now, her body tense, her fear becoming more evident. "Marcus, what's happening? Why are you saying that?" Marcus took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't lie to her, not anymore. She had to know the truth, even if it scared her, even if it broke her trust. "Keisha, they're targeting me," he said, his voice hoarse as the words left his mouth. "They know who I am, and they're coming for us." Her face drained of color. She took a step back, as if she hadn't expected him to say it out loud. She had known something was wrong, but hearing the words spoken so plainly was like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean, they're coming for us?" Her voice trembled as she tried to process the shock. "Who are they, Marcus?" Marcus ran a hand through his hair, his eyes dark with the weight of it all. "I don't know exactly, but they're connected to some people in the FBI. People who've been using the system for their own purposes." He paused before continuing. "I was targeted last night, Keisha. They knew who I was before I even got out of the car." She shook her head slowly, as if trying to deny it, like if she didn't believe it, then it wouldn't be true. "This can't be happening," she whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We need to get out of here. We need to go somewhere safe." Marcus said urgently, his mind racing as he thought of their options. "I've already called James. He's going to help us, but we can't stay here. We're too exposed." Keisha didn't say anything at first. She just stood there looking at him as if the pieces were slowly starting to come together. Her eyes were filled with fear, but there was something else, to something stronger, the fight in her, the refusal to give up. "What about the kids, Marcus? What about them?" Her voice was firm now. There was a new resolve in her, as if she was willing to do whatever it took to protect their family. Marcus looked at her, his heart aching. He couldn't do this without her. He couldn't face this alone. "We'll take them with us, Keisha. We're not leaving anyone behind," he said, his voice steady now. "I'm not letting anything happen to them." She nodded slowly, as if finally accepting the reality of their situation. "All right then, let's go," she said, but her voice was still thick with emotion. her eyes never leaving his face. Marcus grabbed his bag from the bed and started to move toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, a loud knock echoed from the other side of the room. Both of them froze, their bodies stiff with fear. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Marcus took a step back and nodded toward the window without a word. Keisha followed him. They couldn't risk being seen. They couldn't let whoever was on the other side know they were still here. Marcus carefully opened the window and peered outside. The parking lot was empty except for a few cars scattered around the place, but in the distance he saw movement, a figure walking slowly between the parked cars, a tall man wearing a dark coat. It was too far to make out any details, but Marcus felt the coldness in his chest. He knew who it was. It wasn't just any random person, it was someone who was here to find them. Keisha glanced at him, her face pale, but there was no fear in her eyes. Now there was determination. They had no choice. Now they couldn't stay here and wait for whatever was coming next. Marcus helped Keisha through the window first, her feet hitting the ground below, before he followed her out onto the gravel, his eyes constantly scanning the parking lot. The figure in the distance was getting closer, but they had to move now or risk being trapped. Marcus reached for Keisha's hand and pulled her along with him toward the back of the motel. They couldn't take the main entrance, not with the figure coming closer. They had to make it to the street and out of town before anyone figured out they were gone. They moved quickly, staying low and quiet, trying to make as little noise as possible, but every step felt like it could be their last. Every second was precious, and every noise sent their hearts racing. They reached the end of the lot, and Marcus checked the street. It was empty, no cars, no people, just the distant hum of the town behind them. But that wouldn't last for long. They couldn't stay in the open for too long. They had to keep moving. Keisha was breathing hard now, her hands still clutching Marcus's. He could feel her pulse racing in her wrist. The fear was still there, but there was something else, something that kept her going. They were in this together. They would fight together. Marcus looked back at the motel one last time before he turned and pulled Keisha down the street. They couldn't go back. They couldn't stay. They had to find a way to survive whatever was coming for them. But at that moment, all Marcus cared about was keeping his family safe and making sure they had a chance at a future, something they hadn't had in a long time. As they walked into the early morning light, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. This was the start of something much bigger, something that would change their lives forever. But he also knew that no matter what happened, they would face it together, no matter the cost, no matter the cost, no matter the fear, no matter the danger, they would survive. This they had no other choice. Marcus and Keisha walked for what felt like hours, their feet aching from the rough pavement beneath them. The streets of the small town were quiet this early in the morning, but Marcus knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The tension in the air was thick with uncertainty. Every step felt like it carried them closer to something they couldn't see, but could feel in every fiber of their being. Keisha's hand was still in his, her grip tight and steady, but he could feel the fear in her trembling fingers. Every now and then she would glance over at him as if looking for reassurance, but he didn't have any to give. Not now, not when they were on the run and didn't know who they could trust. Keisha was silent now. The fight she had shown earlier still burned in her eyes, but there was a quiet sadness there too, a feeling of helplessness that Marcus couldn't shake. He hated that he couldn't protect her from this. He hated that he had dragged her and the kids into this nightmare, and he couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right choices, if he had done enough. But there was no time to dwell on the past. Not now. They had to keep moving. They couldn't stop, not for anything. He didn't know how long they could keep running, how long they could stay ahead of whoever was coming for them, but he knew they couldn't stay in one place for long. Every new face they passed on the street felt like a threat. Every car that passed them felt like it was there to watch them, track them down. They didn't speak as they walked through the town. They didn't stop to ask for directions or try to find help. They just kept moving forward, one foot in front of the other, hoping that by some miracle they would make it out alive. Marcus knew they had to find a way to get to James, but he didn't know how long it would take or what it would cost them to get there. They couldn't use their phones. They couldn't risk being traced. They couldn't rely on anyone, not after what had happened the previous night. And with every passing second the fear grew deeper inside of him. But there was something else to it, determination, a fire that burned in his chest. He couldn't let his family down. He couldn't let Keisha or the kids suffer because of his decisions. They had to survive this, and they would survive this or he would die trying. They finally reached the outskirts of town, where the buildings began to thin out, and the open road stretched out before them. It was still dark, but the first hints of Light were beginning to break through the sky in the distance. Marcus saw a car parked on the side of the road, a small sedan with tinted windows. He couldn't make out the driver's face, but he could feel the unease in his chest. That's when he realized they weren't alone. They had been followed. They had been tracked. The car wasn't just parked. It was waiting for them. Marcus gripped Keisha's hand tighter and pulled her back into the shadows of the nearby alley. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as they crouched low against the building, trying to stay hidden. Keisha looked up at him, her face filled with fear, but there was something else to something that made Marcus's heart ache with guilt. She was looking at him as if he were her only hope, as if he had all the answers and he didn't have a single one to give. "Marcus, what's happening?" Her voice was a whisper, but it carried all the weight of her fear. Marcus didn't answer her. At first, his mind racing through every possible scenario, but there was only one thing he knew for sure. They had to get away from here. And fast. He peeked around the corner of the building and saw the car moving slowly down the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness as it approached them. Marcus didn't wait. He grabbed Keisha's arm and pulled her down the alley in the opposite direction. His heart was pounding in his chest, but it didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The only thing that mattered was getting them out of here. He didn't look back. He couldn't risk it. They couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. They kept running through the back streets of the town, the narrow alleys and dark corners, offering them some semblance of cover, but it wasn't enough. The sound of tires screeching against the asphalt echoed behind them, and Marcus knew they were being hunted. They were being cornered. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him as they turned another corner and ran into an open street. They had to get to the main road. They had to get away from the town before they were caught. But when Marcus looked ahead, he saw more cars approaching in the distance, blocking their escape route. They were trapped. Marcus's mind raced. He couldn't afford to panic. He had to think fast. But the situation was getting worse by the second, and Keisha's grip on his hand was starting to slip. She was exhausted. They both were, but there was no time to rest. Marcus's thoughts flashed to James and what he had told him to do. Find safety, get out of town. But it seemed impossible now. They were being boxed in, and it didn't matter how fast they ran or how hard they tried to stay hidden. They were going to be caught if they didn't act now. Marcus turned to Keisha, his eyes full of resolve. "Keisha, we need to split up," he said, his voice urgent. She looked at him with wide eyes, her face filled with disbelief. "No, Marcus, I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice shaking, but her resolve was clear. She wasn't going to let him go alone. "Keisha, listen to me," Marcus said, his voice firm, but filled with the weight of what he had to do. "It's the only way we can survive. We have to split up. We can't let them catch us all at once. You have to get to the main road, get to the nearest town. I'll distract them. I'll buy you time. But you have to go." Keisha's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She knew he was right, even if it tore her apart to leave him behind for even a moment. She nodded. "I'll find you, I promise," she whispered. Marcus gave her a quick kiss on the forehead before he turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, his heart racing as he put as much distance between himself and Keisha as possible. He had no plan, no backup, but he had one thing left in him: the fight to survive and to make sure that his family would live to see another day. He ran through the streets, dodging cars and alleyways, trying to keep ahead of whoever was chasing them. His breath was heavy, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He couldn't let them catch him, not yet. Not before he made sure Keisha and the kids were safe. But as he turned a corner, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. The chase had begun. The end